about Costello, CFC and Noonan syndromes and some of the similarities and differences that we see across those disorders in the RAS MAPK pathway. So here we've got a list of what we know to be genetic disorders of the RAS MAPK pathway. Noonan syndrome and neurofibromatosis type 1, both common conditions. Costello and CFC we know to be rare conditions, and they've been joined in recent years by something called Legier syndrome, which is like a mild version of neurofibromatosis type 1, and there are also subtypes of Noonan syndrome that are being recognised. And so here we've got some photos. Some of you might recognise yourselves or your children in these pictures as we go through the talk. And much of my focus this morning is going to be on Costello and CFC, as they are the most relevant things to a lot of the people here. If we go right back to the beginning and we think about genetics and what's genetics, our DNA is what our genes are made of, and these store the instructions for the body's cells to make proteins via RNA, which is like a messenger molecule. And so we've got 20,000 different pairs of genes, and these come in chromosomes. We get one of each pair of chromosomes from our mum and dad, as you'll all remember from either school biology or trips to the genetic clinic, hopefully. And changes in genes can cause differences to how the proteins work. And we know that Costello, CFC and Noonan syndrome are most commonly due to what we call gain-of-function mutations. So the change in the gene is something that means that protein then does something extra. And we can think of that simplistically as them sort of ramping up the signalling in a set of cellular processes. So everything's going into overdrive. But we're still learning about how different proteins work together in these particular cellular pathways. And one of the things that's come out in recent years is that many of the genes that are altered in these conditions are genes that are the instructions for things called kinases. And these are proteins that act to control signaling through the cells. And we can think of this as a domino effect, for example, of one knocking onto the other, and then there being branches within those sort of things. If you think of people who do the Guinness World of Records sort of super complex domino effects, or indeed parts of an engine. So if we think of maybe cogs in a machine, and if we think about them as cogs, that's quite helpful, I think, because that tells us that kinases don't work by themselves. Whilst the cogs are the bit of the machine that we can see moving and doing stuff, actually they need to be held in place by a whole series of other bits of kit, and they're within a framework. But bits of that framework can be crucially important to how the cogs themselves are working. So here we've got a picture of the RAS MAPK pathway, and I apologise, some of you might have seen this before, some of you might not, and it's the sort of slide that when you show doctors, they all kind of go, ugh. So I'm sorry about that, but I think actually I've got a slightly friendlier audience this morning, which is great. So here we've got just a schematic of the way that the proteins sort of sit together. Now actually there's more complexity than we can possibly represent in 3 dimensions, let alone in 2 here. But what you can see is that there are lots of different genes that can cause Noonan syndrome, many different genes that can cause CFC syndrome, just the one gene that causes Costello syndrome, one gene for NF1 and one gene for Legier syndrome. So we've got one pathway with many genes and many disorders, and these range from the common, like NF1, which has only got one gene responsible for it, to Noonan syndrome that's got many genes, some of which have not yet been identified, to the rare Costello syndrome with only one gene, and CFC, where we know there are several different genes, but it's an unusual condition overall. There is overlap, as Bronwyn's already alluded to, between Noonan and CFC syndrome. We'll talk a little more about that in a while. But actually, when we think about a baby who's been born newly with differences, often the greatest degree of overlap that we see is between Costello and CFC syndromes. Those are often both severe conditions that happen newly in the individual, and hence the differential diagnosis is often between those two. So if we think about Noonan syndrome, nobody actually knows how common this condition is, and there's been a quoted incidence of 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 2,500 people. What we do know is that PTPN11 is the most commonly altered gene in people who've got Noonan syndrome, but that there's an extremely variable presentation. And 2/3 of people with a diagnosis of Noonan syndrome are the first affected person in their family. So actually that's quite like a situation for Costello and CFC syndromes, where nearly everybody with that condition is the first affected person in their family. And people with Noonan syndrome might have pulmonary valve stenosis or other congenital heart disease and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Feeding problems are really very common indeed, such that nasogastric tube feeding is very common, and some children will need a gastrostomy. Short stature, undescended testes are quite characteristic, and learning difficulties are present in many people with Noonan syndrome, but these are often at the milder end of the spectrum. If we think about some of the subtypes, Noonan syndrome with multiple lentigines has been referred to as leopard syndrome in the past, and in this condition people often have dark lentigines, dark marks on the skin, and there's a higher rate of deafness and heart conduction problems in that particular group of people, who also often have a more normal height perhaps than people with classical Noonan syndrome. But the more we go on, the more we realise that actually it isn't necessarily as simple as all that, and there is a degree of overlap between those two conditions. NF1 I'll mention briefly. Again, this is a common condition, and half of people with this condition are the first affected person in their family. So that tells us this is something that can be passed through the generations, but that it's very common for it to arise newly. And there's such a wide variety of complications, I won't cover those in detail, but there is an increased relative risk of a whole range of different tumours, but also many features in common with other RAS MAPK pathway disorders. And in fact, some of the children with NF1 who are born before they develop the typical skin findings actually are considered more likely to have Noonan syndrome on the basis of having shared facial features, for example, a relatively large head size, some feeding difficulties, for example. Leahy syndrome I'll touch on briefly. This is much rarer than NF1, and one reason for this is that the SPRED1 gene that causes Leahy syndrome when it's altered is a very small gene, whereas the NF1 gene is a very big gene. And most people with this condition have an affected parent. So that's telling us that actually it's overall a much milder condition. And many of these parents won't even have known that there's anything different about them until something is ascertained in their child. And many of these people will have cafe patches and skin fold freckling, as we see in NF1, but they don't get the lumps on the skin that are the very characteristic thing of NF1. So if we think about Costello and CFC, this is some slightly old data from our lab in Manchester. We've been doing the diagnostic testing for these conditions since the genes were identified. And you can see here the Costello cohort with most of the gene changes being G12S. And then if we think about everyone else in terms of if it's not Costello syndrome, is it CFC syndrome? BRAF is much the most commonly altered gene. But you can see lots of these gene changes are actually individually very rare. So there'll be people here who have got a gene change that has only been identified in 1, 2, or no other people, for example. So if we think about Costello, HRAS gene changes are the be-all and end-all. Essentially, if you don't have an HRAS gene change, then you don't have Costello syndrome. We're getting to have a little bit of doubt as to whether some of the more unusual and more recently defined changes in HRAS are something we should call Costello syndrome or not. But I don't know if there's anybody here today who falls into that category. But people with Costello syndrome are often big babies with excess amniotic fluid, as you know, and problems in the neonatal period like low blood sugars and arrhythmias are very characteristic. Cardiomyopathy and congenital heart disease are pretty common, and then this very, very poor feeding and irritability is something that I know is a major, major issue for many people. And the excess skin on hands and feet and ulnar deviation is something that in the neonatal period don't really cause any problems, but they can act as a clue for doctors who are trying to work out why this baby's got the differences. And as children grow up, we know about the learning disability, short stature, and high tumour risk that Roman will expand on later. We think a little more about the heart disease. About 50% of people with Costello syndrome will have some form of congenital heart disease, and valvular pulmonary stenosis is the commonest. but actually abnormalities of other heart valves can also happen. And we don't think that complex congenital heart disease is a big part of what happens for people with Costello syndrome, but what we do know is that thickening of the heart muscle, cardiomyopathy, can be seen in quite a lot of people when they're under appropriate cardiac follow-up. And the arrhythmias that can be present even in utero are something that about 50% of individuals are identified to have. And typically, it's the atria, the top chambers of the heart, that get affected with this chaotic pattern. So here's just some pictures that you will recognise, I'm sure, if you know people with Costello syndrome, some of the excess skin and other things that can need physical treatments, especially as children grow up. If we try and think about how common Costello syndrome is, that's quite a difficult question to answer. But here in the UK, we're a relatively well-characterised population. We know how many births we have. And because until recently there were only 2 labs in the UK that were offering testing for Costello syndrome, we think we've had quite good ascertainment of all of the people who've actually been diagnosed with this condition. And so in the years up to 2010, we did a survey, and it looks as though there are about 2 people a year diagnosed or born with Costello syndrome in the UK. And if we think about what happens to those individuals, obviously one of the major concerns is that actually babies can often be very sick indeed. And we know that the mortality is greatest in the first year. And so that's obviously very difficult for people who've got a new baby with Costello syndrome. But realistically, once you get beyond the first and second years of life, we know that prospects are looking better. Right. Not sure. Anyway, so does the exact gene change in RAS matter to what the pattern of difference is that the person gets? And the answer to that is yes. It can be a bit tricky to know because obviously G12S is so much more common than all of the other gene changes that it makes our comparisons quite difficult because the numbers of people with other versions of the gene are quite small. One of the things that has been queried is there a higher cancer risk for children who've got a G12A gene change? And this hasn't been confirmed, although we have seen several tumours in children with this gene change. And one of the things that's a really important sort of balancing piece of information in this is to think about the babies who've got the really severe gene changes, who often don't make it out of hospital. Actually, those children don't survive long enough to develop a tumour because the way that cancers develop is that you have to have a whole series of mutations in order to develop something that is out of control. And therefore, actually, you have to live for a number of years often before you get into that risk period. We don't think that the G13 gene change that has been identified in up to 10% of some Costello syndrome case series is something that gives us a classical Costello phenotype often. And many of the individuals in the United States who've been diagnosed with that gene change, it was through a chip test that actually was looking for Noonan syndrome, CFC, and Costello syndrome together. And we think that gene change does give people less in the way of short stature, and tumours haven't been reported either. If we think about the spectrum of gene changes, we know that HRAS is commonly mutated in cancer, and the common gene change in cancer is called G12V, and that's something that we don't see very commonly in Costello syndrome at all. And importantly, where we do see it in a baby with Costello syndrome, unfortunately the outcome is not very good. So we know of all of the people who we've ascertained in the lab in Manchester, actually they've not survived beyond a few weeks of age. We're always, as a medical profession, trying to look for things that would be a really good indicator that this is definitely one condition or definitely another. And the more we go on, the more we realise that actually that isn't necessarily realistic. So we could have thought about the neonatal atrial heart rhythm problems. But actually, we know that people with RAF1 gene changes, and that's a cause of Noonan syndrome, get that very commonly. We could think about embryonal rhabdomyosarcoma, the big deal in Costello syndrome. But actually, there's now been a case series of patients with SOS1 gene changes, another Noonan syndrome gene, who've developed that tumour. And therefore, whilst the relative risk may be lower, it's not something that of itself tells us, yes, this will be Costello syndrome. We then think about the nasal and nasolabial papillomas that many people get with Costello syndrome as they get older. But actually, in some of our older patients with changes in a gene called SHOC2, they've developed those, and therefore that tells us that that isn't specific either. The fact being that actually none of this matters if we're able to test the genes, and if we can test HRAS and see if it's Costello syndrome or not, then that's helpful. I think what this does do is it helps to tie us together and unite us as a community and say these are actually shared differences that are happening, albeit with different frequencies. So if we think about a new diagnosis of Costello syndrome, the important things to do are to confirm the diagnosis, to address feeding and developmental needs, arrange cardiac assessment and follow-up, and abdominal ultrasounds, probably we'll talk about more later. We do recommend cerebral MRI scanning, so to check that there's no evidence of hydrocephalus, and also we know that there can be progressive growth of the cerebellum as children with Costello syndrome age. And clearly at that stage, support group information is something that we would hope people providing the likely diagnosis would be able to give. Oops. And in terms of ongoing care, it's largely more of the same really. But as people grow, clearly orthopedic complications and growth parameters are important things to keep an eye on. And similarly, just making sure that people are doing as well as we would expect for someone with Costello syndrome. We switch and think about CFC syndrome. Hopefully the message that will come out of this is that there are many similarities. We've already talked about the fact that mutation in BRAF or many other genes can cause CFC. And again, like for Costello syndrome, this is nearly always new in the individual. Again, we're often thinking about big babies with excess amniotic fluid, and congenital heart disease and cardiomyopathy are very common. Poor feeding, again, is something that's present in the majority of people with CFC when they're born, but sometimes it actually develops later, which is something we don't really understand why that is at the moment. And again, as many of you will know, learning disability, short stature, and epilepsy are things that can evolve as the children grow, and also the skin problems are something that are very common in CFC, often to do with dry skin, and poor hair growth can be part of it. And does the gene which is altered make a difference? The answer to that is that we're still waiting for definitive confirmation of lots of these potential differences, but yes, it does. Again, like for G12S in Costello syndrome, because BRAF gene change is so much the most common, and because Q257R is so much the most common BRAF change, it's really quite difficult to make comparisons because we've got, if you remember that chart, lots and lots of people with different mutations, but not the same as one another. And we think that the precise gene change involved is going to be important as well. But having said that, there's still great variability even between patients with exactly the same primary mutation. And that tells us that other factors have got to be really important in this. So there are going to be other genetic factors that we don't know anything about yet. There'll be other environmental factors, there'll be chance things, and you name it. So in terms of how common CFC is, we don't fully know. But we do think that it is commoner than Costello syndrome. When we look at patients referred in for testing, we make many more diagnoses of CFC than we do of Costello syndrome. But within this, there are quite a lot of challenges because there are many genes. There are some people with a classical CFC phenotype who don't yet have a gene change that's identifiable, which suggests to us there are probably other genes out there like for Noonan syndrome. There can be a different difficulty with recognising the pattern of CFC because it isn't as characteristic as Costello syndrome necessarily. And certainly the large-scale project called the Deciphering Developmental Disorders project that's been running in the UK for the last 3 years has picked up several patients with gene changes in CFC genes where the referring clinician hadn't thought that that was necessarily the diagnosis. Retrospectively, when we think about the patient and their pattern, it often is consistent, but equally without knowing that information, we wouldn't have necessarily made a diagnosis. There's also the query as to whether CFC or Noonan syndrome is the appropriate diagnosis for some individuals, and we'll talk a little more about that in a moment. And genetic testing has been really difficult because when you've got lots of different genes, it gets difficult and expensive. If we think about BRAF changes, we've got some pictures here of a gang that you'll probably mainly recognise if you've been to several of these meetings. And moderate to severe learning disability is very common in this group. Feeding problems, heart problems, and there are some individuals who've had severe epilepsy. And what you can see is a fairly consistent feature. It's this large head size with curly hair and some of the skin features, so dry skin, for example. We think about MEK1 or MAPK1, they're the same thing. Geneticists are awful for changing names of genes, but the mutation gets referred to as Y130C, that's the most common one. And again, this is often quite a severe pattern, and several of these people we know have also had severe epilepsy, like the people with BRAF changes. And we've seen also generalised contractures developing in some children with and young adults with this particular gene change. And we don't know if that's specific to this gene change or if it's something that is perhaps just a chance finding at the moment. And the other thing is that often people seem to have fewer skin differences if they've got this gene change. You can think about MEK2 mutations, MAP2K2. These overall are rare, and there's only very small numbers of people known with these gene changes. But what does seem to be fairly consistent is the fact that their skin differences will be quite marked, and that's what would often alert people to this being a CFC pattern. So the other thing that's come out of the literature in the last few years is that there are many families where these gene changes have been passed down. So often people have had a bit of learning disability, but not severe. And here you can see, I think it's a 4 or 5 generation family from the US, and that's, I think, a UK paper of a mother with 2 sons, all of whom had got a fairly consistent big pattern of differences. KRAS mutations are often the ones that we end up arguing about most as doctors because, again, there are very small numbers of patients, but whether they fit into a Noonan or a CFC pattern is often quite debatable. These are nearly all new gene changes, but there have been a few mutations that have been described as being passed down the generations. And we think that often the skin features are relatively mild, and so that could lead people to say, well, this isn't CFC then. But equally, if people have got quite severe cardiac phenotypes, which again we have recognised to be quite common in people who've got KRAS gene changes, then it's something that is open for argument. And certainly some of our patients who we've met with these gene changes are needing special schooling, for example, which is relatively unusual in Noonan syndrome. Just a word about Noonan-like syndrome with loose allergen hair, one of the worst possible terms for something. It also gets called Mazzanti syndrome after Laura Mazzanti, who's an Italian pediatric endocrinologist, I think, who described it. And this is due to a particular change in a gene called SHOC2. And when this was first reported back in 2009, we wondered about our undiagnosed CFC patients. And we looked for changes in this gene, and actually we did find a significant number. So I personally would regard this as being something that's compatible with a clinical diagnosis of CFC syndrome. And so far, all of the patients who've been described with this gene change have had it happen newly in them, which again tells us that this is a relatively severe pattern of differences that people often have. But again, it serves as a reminder to us that actually this is a group of disorders with overlapping features, and often it isn't possible to put people necessarily into very separate categories. If we think about managing CFC, the principles are very similar to those that we've already described for Costello syndrome. Confirming the diagnosis is clearly going to be key. Addressing feeding and developmental needs, cardiac things, cerebral MRI for much the same indications that we've talked about for Costello syndrome, and support group information. In terms of ongoing care, we don't think there's any need for tumour screening for CFC. There have been occasional tumours reported, but actually at such low frequencies that it makes no screening appropriate, essentially. If we think about rare disorders of the RAS MAPK pathway, will there be treatments in the future? And the answer to that is that we certainly hope so. The RAS MAPK pathway has already been extensively studied in the context of cancer, and chemotherapy drugs have been developed that act on the pathway. However, if we think about the setting in which chemo drugs are being given, that's clearly hugely different to the setting of children who might be actually doing quite well, but looking for something that would act to create a very subtle effect compared to a chemotherapeutic effect. And what is possible is that other existing medications might be helpful in altering pathway activity. If we think about those other bits of the machine other than the cogs themselves, how we alter those. And what's important to say is that as and when people are thinking about very targeted treatments, there is always the possibility that actually things will be effective only from one particular gene change or the changes in one particular part of one particular gene. And again, that's something that makes it less obviously treatable. If we think about the pathway as a whole, treatment trials for aspects of NF1 are already underway. And so that, again, is something that can give us hope if we think about dysregulated RAS MAPK pathway signaling as being core to NF1. What's actually underway in the States, I think one will talk about more from the Seattle meeting that was presented, but people are looking at the neurocognitive effects of agents that modulate pathway activity in the NF1 group. When we think about treatment trials, it's also going to be important to say we need to decide what sort of outcome measures are going to be helpful. So what are the real priorities for patients and families? So in summary, Costello and CFC can present in a very similar way. We think that Costello syndrome is associated with a higher chance of specific complications that need surveillance, particularly screening for rhabdomyosarcoma and bladder tumours. And we also recognise a higher rate of orthopaedic complications in the Costello population compared to those with CFC. In terms of CFC, we think there's better overall survival, but there are more variable developmental outcomes. And so there are some people with CFC who have considerably more learning disability than would be typical for Costello syndrome, for example. So I'm going to finish there. And I don't know if there's any immediate questions, but hopefully a lot of what might be specific questions will be being considered later in the day. I'll just finish by thanking everybody who's listed and